So this brings us to our second installment, Africans and the Early Republic. So in the post-revolutionary era, in the North, slavery was not really economically essential. We see the beginnings of an industrial revolution taking place and the increase of European immigrant labor, bringing in cheap white laborers. And as a result of this lack of an economic necessity, we see natural rights doctrines and also like religious morality flourishing. And many of the New England states begin to quickly move towards emancipation. So, for example, in Massachusetts, there was a free and equal clause in the Constitution, and Black men had the right to vote in Massachusetts. However, the struggle against slavery was far more difficult in the Mid-Atlantic. So we see states like Vermont and Massachusetts having their constitutions provide for immediate emancipation, Vermont being the first state to abolish slavery in 1777, and then Massachusetts following soon after in 1780. However, many states took on a gradual emancipation route. So what this means is that they didn't abolish slavery. You work for a certain determined period of time. After your time is over, then you are emancipated. So let's say like the age of 25, for example, you are enslaved, and then once you turn 26, you become emancipated, for example. And so we see states like New Jersey, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, as well as New York engaging in these practices, and some of them maintaining them up through the Civil War. So in 1793, we see Eli Whitney inventing a cotton gin, and this cotton gin speeds the process of cotton and encourages the westward expansion of cotton growing in the United States. And around the same time, we also see the British textile industry experiencing dramatic growth, and because of enslaved labor, the textile industry in the North booms, and increased cotton cultivation fosters continued and increased enslavement. And cotton becomes the most lucrative U.S. export, and it reinvigorated the slave labor system, because prior we begin to see slavery kind of on the decline because it becomes kind of decreasingly profitable. However, Eli Whitney and his cotton gin shifted all of that, even though that was not necessarily his intention to expand and accelerate slavery. So discourses on race and racism. Many scientists of the 18th and 19th centuries believed that race was based upon climate and also diet. So if you took people out of their normal climate, they believed that their complexions would change within 10 to 12 generations. This is science, people. And so you have Henry Moss of Virginia in 1792, who had vitiligo, which basically turned him visibly white in the span of 3 years. As his skin changed, Moss began to market himself as a great curiosity in Philadelphia and soon earned enough money to buy his freedom. Doctors studied him, people like Benjamin Rush, who, according to his findings, believed that blackness or being black was a form of leprosy. And so he used climate theory to support abolition, this idea that, hey, we took these Africans out of Africa. In 10 to 12 generations, they too will be white. Then what are we going to do? We have to free them. Sometimes racism can be used in really fun ways, right? So then you have Samuel Stanhope Smith, who also believed that improving the social environment would tap into the innate equality of humankind and dramatically uplift non-white races by removing them from where they were from originally. And also we have John Bowlby. So John Bowlby was born in the 1770s in Kingston, Jamaica with vitiligo. By 2 years old, his master and others begin to call him, this great curiosity, and he begins to be put on display in a quote-unquote freak show exhibition. So people would pay throughout Kingston in his younger years to come see him. And then later on, he was brought throughout England and paraded in the 1700s and early 1800s as a part of a freak show like circus. And he used to say, I can't stand that. I will not be sold like the monkeys. People would, not believing that his skin was naturally the way it was, because they didn't know what vitiligo was back then, would try to rub at his skin to see if it would come off. And as a result of him being toured around, he was able to purchase his freedom and then later exhibit himself and make all of his remaining money from that. Because mind you, literally, this man had been utilized like a freak show since he was an infant, or I'll say since he technically was a toddler. So in terms of like how one makes money for themselves, in the early 1800s, there really were not a whole host of options. And so this also brings us to Notes from the State of Virginia by Thomas Jefferson, where Jefferson discusses the nature of a good society, right? In this, he also articulates that he believes that indigenous peoples could potentially become civilized. However, people of African descent were incapable of mental improvement. He believed in this concept of polygenesis, meaning that they potentially were even of a whole separate origination of species. Also, this concept of polygenesis was later used as an excuse to send free Africans in the US back to Africa, saying that, hey, they'll never be able to assimilate. We need to return them home because they're not of the same species as us anyway. So with the ban on the transatlantic slave trade, this did not end slavery, but it created instead a domestic trade, which focused on the buying and selling of African slaves within America. It also focused on the forced reproduction of African slaves within America. So you would even have people who were considered to be breeders, and it was a part of their like special focus to ensure that African peoples were being forced to copulate, but also as a result reproduce, so that way they could create more currency in the form of human beings. Throughout the Revolutionary War, we see wartime runaways as well as revolutionary participation, and we also see, after the American Revolutionary War, states beginning to repeal longstanding bans on manumission. Manumission is where a master would free their slave or their enslaved person on their own, as opposed to having a law that would force them to. And so masters often would profit from self-purchase agreements, right? So you have enslaved people who were able to earn enough money to obtain their freedom, and their masters might say, oh, well, inflation, so therefore let's add on some more money to this, or interest, let's tack on some more money to your original buying price, so on and so forth. And so masters would often profit from their enslaved peoples buying their own freedom. And oftentimes enslaved peoples would pay in installments. And so as a result, self-purchase often left Africans in financial trouble, because they literally would be spending every last dime that they had earned through getting themselves hired out, for example, towards their effort of freedom, which means they don't have anything else to live off of. The emergence of a free black class. Most of the black population remained in slavery, and in the Deep South, you have very few masters deciding to free their enslaved peoples. Free black classes emerged throughout the Revolutionary era, and the earliest black community institutions consisted of mutual aid societies. And these societies spread to every black urban community, and they maintained concepts around Christian moral character. We also see the emergence of black Freemasons, and also we see black independent churches becoming community centers, and also the foundation of schools that were black owned, created, and operated. And we also see petitions and pamphlets being published by black authors protesting enslavement and advocating for abolition, right? So one of the most famous petitions was David Walker's Appeal. The full title was David Walker's Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, but in particular and very expressly to those of the United States of America. It's a very long title. We often just call it the Appeal. But what it did was it challenged free blacks to see themselves as a part of a worldwide movement for freedom. He's like, look, we are not free, okay, unless all of our people are free. And it invoked a rhetoric of freedom to rise up against slavery, and it even encouraged blacks to use violence to overthrow it. And he believed that the end of slavery was divinely sanctioned, and he also would heavily criticize white Christians, saying y'all really can't be Christians and maintain this system of slavery. That's a joke. And this petition was seen as being so dangerous that it was banned in many places throughout the South. But because David Walker was a secondhand clothes dealer, what he would do was he would often sew his pamphlet into the lining of jacket pockets that sailors would then take with them and smuggle to the South. And it would be disseminated that way. As a result of Africans absconding from enslavement or fleeing slavery, we see the development of what are called maroon communities. So the term maroon comes from the Spanish word cimarron. And so maroon communities were established all throughout the Americas, in the Caribbean, Brazil, Ecuador, Virginia, Florida with the Black Seminoles, Colombia, as well as other states, right? So we see in the bayous, there were maroon communities, in the Everglades in Florida, the Seminole Reserve in Florida, Elliott's Cut in South Carolina, and even there being maroon communities in New York City. So the most famous enslaved rebellion of all time became the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution lasted from 1791 to 1804, based upon ideas of égalité, liberté, et fraternité, right? Equality, liberty, brotherhood, which was established by the French Revolution's Declarations of the Rights of Man. And the island of Haiti was formerly known as Saint-Domingue. Saint-Domingue was controlled by the French, and it was one of the most profitable colonies in the Western Hemisphere. 40% of Britain and France's sugar came from Saint-Domingue. 60% of its coffee was produced in Saint-Domingue. Saint-Domingue had more enslaved Africans than any other colony outside of Brazil, because Brazil had the most. 4 million enslaved Africans were brought to Brazil compared to America's 450,000. And so the Haitian Revolution under Toussaint Louverture, Dessalines, and Macandal and others became the most successful enslaved rebellion. And it led to this abolition of slavery in Saint-Domingue, and it led to the creation of this independent Black Republic, which was Haiti. And as a result of the amount of financial debt that Napoleon was in, as a result of the Haitian Revolution, as well as other wars prior, we see France selling Louisiana to the United States in the Louisiana Purchase, in which they sold 827,000 miles of land west of the Mississippi River, that of course was not really theirs to sell in the first place, but we already know that part. So another rebellion that was quite famous was Gabriel's Rebellion, that took place in 1800 in Richmond, Virginia, and approximately 100 enslaved men planned to end slavery. Their goal was to kidnap the governor, James Monroe. However, the weather was against them. There was like this torrential downpour that like washed out the roads, and in that interim time, the plot was revealed by an enslaved person. And we see Gabriel and 25 other people being. So prior to Gabriel's Rebellion, Virginia law allowed for the education of enslaved peoples, allowing them to read and write, and also to train enslaved Africans in skilled trades. However, after 1800, this was repealed. So some additional aftermath of Gabriel's Rebellion. In 1808, Virginia banned the hiring out of slaves, which meant that it was harder for enslaved peoples to be able to earn additional money to gain their freedom. And it also required free blacks to leave the state within 12 months or face re-enslavement. You could not be free in Virginia and stay free in Virginia. Also, we see free blacks having to petition the legislature to stay in the state. And if they were to, they had to be aided or supported in that goal by white friends or allies. So the very existence of free blacks challenged conditions of slave states. And so then we see the German Coast Uprising, which was also called Andries Rebellion. It was called Andries Rebellion not because one of the leaders was named Andrew, but because it took place on Manuel or Major Andries' plantation. So in 1811, the German Coast Uprising takes place in Louisiana, near New Orleans. And so it took place January 8th through 10th of 1811, and it was one of the largest rebellions in the United States. There were 400 to 500 enslaved Africans who participated. It was led by an enslaved African from Saint-Domingue, aka Haiti, right? Because during the Haitian Revolution, many French slaveholders in Saint-Domingue escaped to Louisiana, but also brought their enslaved Africans with them. So Charles Deslandes is one of the people who leads the way. Armed with cane knives, axes, and clubs, they killed Andry's son and wounded Manuel Andry in St. John Baptist Parish. They then left St. John the Baptist Parish to head into St. Charles's Parish towards New Orleans, and their numbers grew. Now, mind you, Manuel Andry is not dead, but he is wounded, and with his wounded self, he alerts other whites, and we see them escaping St. Baptist Parish and St. Charles Parish to go to New Orleans, where they felt they would be safer. And so, as they moved from plantation to plantation, these rebels, more people would join them, right? So what started off with being about 25 people grew into about 500. And so they took possession of guns, of drums, and of flags, and would march themselves from plantation to plantation. In St. Charles Parish, they killed Jean-Francois Trepanier, who was also a plantation owner. And so William Claiborne was the governor at the time. He called out the militia. He also imposed a curfew for all black people. And we see the U.S. Navy and Army being called out. They had a collection of nearly 700 soldiers to put down this rebellion, and it was one of the most brutally repressed enslaved uprisings in the United States. 95 people were executed during the uprising in retaliation upon being tried in New Orleans. 18 of them were executed by firing squad, and their heads were strung aloft at various intervals from New Orleans to St. Andrews Plantation. And so after the rebellion, authorities tightened the restrictions on governing the activities of free blacks in Louisiana because they believed that the free blacks were in support of the German Coast Uprising. At the same time, they also freed some enslaved Africans who were loyal to their masters and either provided information or served in the militia. So 1817, we see the American Colonization Society being started by white Americans who sought to remove free blacks from the United States. When it comes to colonization and repatriation, we see Sierra Leone being colonized by the British in 1787 as a space for newly freed blacks in the Americas, right? We have the British Navy, who brought in more than 50,000 quote-unquote recaptives who were also termed liberated Africans. And the government therefore introduced a deliberate policy of turning them into a homogenous Christian community. And these people became Creoles, who were the educated West African elite, which then leads to later oppression and conflict of those who were indigenous to Sierra Leone prior to the creation of Sierra Leone. And in 1822, Liberia becomes a colony. 1847, we see Liberia gaining independence, but more than 12,000 blacks were transported to Liberia. All right, so I'm going to pause this here. I hope you are having a wonderful rest of your day. Take care of yourselves.